Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from the Raja Press. Thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID. What does it mean when we say after in the time of COVID? What does after actually mean? Is there a return to the old times? And what will be the new normal? Who determines the after? And what does that after really mean? Many of you who've been watching the show probably are fed up with me repeating the little quote from Arundhati Roy's essay on the portal. She writes, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different, she says. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. To discuss this and many other topics, I speak with Phyllis Bennis, director of the new Internationalism Project at the Institute of Policy Studies, about the changes to economic and political life in America and internationally since the start of the pandemic, and why we perhaps can't get back to the normal. Phyllis, a very warm welcome to you. It's just wonderful to catch you so that you can appear on the show. I know you've been incredibly busy, so welcome.
Yes, thanks, Firoz. It's great to be with you. It's great to see you again. It's been a long time. It's great to have this opportunity to have this discussion.
Indeed, indeed. So Phyllis, let's start. Well, what does the after? Is there an after? Or is this a complete transformation, and in whose interests?
Ooh, big questions. I think there's little doubt that this is an enormous transformation that we have seen and are seeing around the world. That it happened so incredibly fast has been an extraordinary thing to see. And all of the things that it has exposed, this pandemic, despite the language of we're all in it together, we're all in the same boat, completely not true. We may be all in the same rough water, but we are in very different boats. A few of us are in yachts, and the rest of us are in little rowboats or maybe paper boats or clinging to life preservers. There's no way in the world that we can say that this virus is an equal opportunity catastrophe. The virus, of course, is equal opportunity. It can strike anyone. But the impact of being ill, of being diagnosed with this virus, even how one dies, is completely shaped by issues of race and class and gender and geography all around the world. So on the one hand, those are the exposés that we are seeing, as Arundhati Roy wrote so powerfully, that it is exposing to the sunlight these long-standing fissures, long-standing divides, long-standing chasms in our societies over race and class and gender and all of those things. But I think one of the other things we should not leave out is that in the response to the pandemic, because it was sudden and urgent all at the same time, and because the first cases were emerging among wealthy white people in northern countries, after China, that was the next batch, you saw an extraordinary outpouring of funding for new projects, for not so much for healthcare as we see now. We're seeing the results of that failure. But here in the United States, the wealthiest country, not only in the world today, but the wealthiest country in the history of humanity, we're seeing it's now over $6.5 trillion. That's one of those numbers that is so big, it's almost unfathomable how much that is. But $6.5 trillion has been created and spent within a matter of less than 2 months. And this after an era in which we have been told there's not enough money for a Green New Deal. There's not enough money for healthcare for all. There's not enough money to make sure that water is a right and not a privilege. We would love to do those things, but we don't have enough money for that. Suddenly, we have enough money to spend $2 trillion bailing out banks and corporations, and then another 2 trillion, and $500 billion on small businesses and nonprofits, and a few hundred billion on small checks to individuals. But the bulk of that money, the bulk of that $6 trillion is going to the biggest corporations and the banks. And suddenly there was all the money we needed for that. And we didn't hear anyone saying, oh, we don't have enough money to pay for that. So it raises new possibilities that when this stage of the crisis is over, and I guess in answer to your first question, Feroz, how do we know when this is over? I guess one way I would say it is when considerations of this pandemic stop shaping every aspect of our lives, so that we can think about going outside, meeting people. Maybe we'll be able to hug people who are old friends. Maybe we'll be able to walk outside without a mask, even if we still need to put on a mask when we go inside with any other people. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think there will come a time, hopefully not too long in the future, when the desperation of this will no longer be shaping how we see ourselves and our place in the world, how we see our neighbors, how we see the people that we know who work in hospitals, who work in food service, who pick up the garbage, who are doing these crucial areas of work that make it possible for the rest of us to live our lives with inconvenience rather than death. And I don't know how long that's going to take, but I hope it won't be too long.
I mean, it seems to me that there's all this money being poured into banks, into the capitalist world, basically, sidesteps a much more profound issue, and that is that the virus, like many other viruses, swine flu, SARS, etc., which we've seen increasingly happening, which are zoonotic. That is, they transfer from animal kingdom to the humans, are directly a product of industrial agriculture, deforestation, and industrial livestock production. This is something that Rob Wallace, author of Big Farms Make Big Flu, was very clear about in an interview we did with him a couple of weeks ago. And the point that John Holloway, who we interviewed thereafter, makes is that people talk about Extinction Rebellion, but he is posing the question that we are facing extinction of humanity. This is only the first of many other viruses that we will see propagated unless those industrial agriculture are not dealt with. And there seems to be a complete silence on this matter.
I'm not a scientist. I can't sort of evaluate the urgency of that. It may well be. I don't think we know. It doesn't seem to me that this is the first of these viruses. As you say, the others, SARS, MERS, there have been others before. The pandemic that swept the world in 1918, 100 years ago. We don't know that was so different at the time. So I don't know either the cause or how many more are out there, if you will. But certainly the way we have been living is coming under challenge in a new way, because people are seeing some of the consequences. When water in places like California is diverted so consistently for so many generations away from people and towards industrial agriculture, we know that's a problem. We see these things. The question I think that we have to be looking at is, how do we, in the midst of this, at a moment when our friends, our families, our neighbors, the people we love, and the people we don't even know, but whom we care about because we are human beings, because we are internationalists, because of all of that, people's lives are being destroyed by this virus right now. How do we simultaneously make ourselves accountable to that vast reality in social solidarity and helping people survive this catastrophe, even while we try to look ahead to what it's going to take to make sure that ending this crisis does not take us back to what we used to call normal. Because as you and I know, Firoz, there was nothing normal about life before this pandemic. For those of us who were privileged, those of us who were privileged by race and class and gender and all those ways, things were pretty normal. You know, we were richer or poorer, we had better or worse jobs, we had more or less time to do our political work and act on our political passions to change the world. But things were relatively normal. For the vast majority of people, there was nothing normal about it. If you were not white, if you were not middle class or more somewhere, if you were not in all of those privileged positions, there was nothing normal about life before. And we're seeing that now in the calls. I mean, we see it so dramatically in India, where there was this overnight demand that suddenly there's going to be a lockdown, shelter in place, everybody must go home, and everyone had 4 hours to figure out what that means and what to do. Well, for a few people, it meant crowding the supermarkets to buy as much food as possible, to stock up so that when you were stuck in your house for however long it was going to be, you would be okay. But for the vast majority of people in India who don't have, number one, access to stores that are more than tiny little kiosks, number two, who don't have money because they work, if they work at all, in the informal sector, getting work from day to day and getting paid from day to day. So there is no money saved. There is no stockpiling that's possible. People who were trying to go home to their villages because home, where they were asking to be sheltered, and this is something that Arundhati Roy also spoke to so powerfully, what they were being asked to do in the name of separating people was to go into a locked zone that was so incredibly crowded that undoubtedly far more people would die as a result. That's what we were facing in the first weeks and months now of this crisis. So how we move forward from that to a place where inequality is not the guiding principle of our lives, inequality within states and the vast inequality between states. How do we simultaneously take care of people now at this moment of life and death crisis and look forward to how do we change the world that we will come into as this crisis ends? I think that's a huge challenge.
It seems to me there are two dynamics, you know, and it's very much taking off from where Arundhati Roy ends with her essay. On the one hand, certainly many of those who I've spoken to across the African region, across Latin America, in Asia, is the increasing militarization of the streets, the use of armed police and other military forces. In Africa, I mean, take Kenya, for example, it's quite clear that the virus was brought there by international travelers. Now, you know, people who live in the slums are not the international travelers, even if in their minds.
Is a hotbed of jet flights.
Exactly. Right. And so rather than focus on isolating the middle classes and making sure that there are tests and there are tracing of people, what has happened is that excuses used just to militarize people. In some instances, more people die in a day as a result of the police attacks than are being killed by the virus. And they've introduced curfews. I mean, as if the virus doesn't transmit at night; it just knows that it's daytime. So then, but it is a vast imprisonment of a large population. One of the people we spoke to in Kenya said, it is like being in prison. In the daytime, you're let out, and at nighttime, you're locked up.
Absolutely.
A graphic image.
It's a horrific image, and it's one that is being replicated in different forms all over the place. In northern countries where poverty is not concentrated with either that intensity or that concentration of people. The slum known as Kibera in Nairobi is the largest so-called slum in all of Africa. And it's several million people who live in this enormous area out on the outskirts of the city in incredibly crowded environments. And the notion that there is any possibility of following the recommendations of whether it's the World Health Organization or the public health agencies within Kenya or anyone else that starts with wash your hands constantly. Well, that's fine if you have running water and clean water and soap. All of those things are enormously scarce in places like Kibera. And then you get to the question of crowding. You know, this kind of shelter at home is a guarantee for spreading the virus. If anyone in the family has gone out to try and find food, to try and bring water back, no one there has running water in their homes. So all of these things are guaranteed to spread the virus much more quickly. And then you have, because I think this is something, Ferouz, that you and I have both looked at in the past, the question of militarization, both in the context of wars that are expanding still. It's something we're not talking about very much right now. The wars that the US and other countries, but led by the US, have been waging around the world, those wars have not stopped for this virus. Those wars continue. What has stopped has been the outside attention to those wars, because people are so focused on the internal situation, the internal crisis caused by the virus. But the militarization of our communities that has taken such an extraordinary escalating turn in the last, say, 5 years, particularly in the years since Trump has been in office, not only in the United States, but certainly here, and then the degree to which Trump's support for this kind of militarization and the rise of the far right has given an enabling capacity to right-wing forces all around the world. So you have the rise of Bolsonaro in Brazil, you have Duterte in the Philippines, you have these dictators around the world who are relying on a US credential to go ahead and use all the force you want against anyone in your country who you determine are the, quote, outsiders. The rise of this far right mobilization. Here in the US, just in the last couple of days, we've seen these extraordinary right-wing mobilizations in state capitals. There have been 160 of these right-wing demonstrations so far, challenging the decision by governors in a number of states to maintain a lockdown in their states because they are nowhere near the so-called reducing of the curve. They have not even reached the plateau yet. These are areas where the number of cases is still on the rise. And what we saw, for example, in Michigan, where the governor had announced an extension of the statewide stay-at-home orders, keeping all but essential businesses shut, there were these right-wing forces, white men with guns, many of them with AK-47s, which are, they are semi-automatics with a small adjustment. They become fully automatic military weapons, and they invaded the State House. I was wondering if they had been Black, if those men with guns invading the state capitol had been Black, what would have been the response of the state and local police in these state capitals, in this case in Michigan? It's a frightening thought. In this case, they were allowed to have their protest. They were endorsed by President Trump, who tweeted out, "Liberate Michigan, liberate," I think it was Arkansas, identifying these states where governors have made clearly a necessary decision to keep a lockdown in place because of the spread being so rapid. And the response has been armed, what amounts to insurrection. And it's being answered very calmly. Nobody's too worried about it because it's so thoroughly racialized in this case. Imagine if they had been Black, if they had been Native Americans, if they had been Latinx people. This is a very, very dangerous set of developments that we're seeing.
And it is the Blacks, the Latinx, it is those populations who are being decimated by the virus.
Exactly.
And many people have raised the issue: is this a eugenics policy, whether with intent or otherwise?
I think that gets into a very dangerous sense here. I don't think that the conspiracy theorists who claim that this is a a weapon that was released to do X. I don't think there's any evidence of that. I don't think there's any possibility of that. What we see in terms of the racialized character is not in who gets infected. It's in who does not have access to medical care, not only right now, but historically. Who is most likely to have the kinds of diseases that we learned very quickly are the main way that somebody is likely to have the most serious kind of impact of this virus rather than surviving it. That they had, one, if they're older, but particularly if they're older and had asthma, or they had diabetes or heart disease. Well, who's most likely, say in this country or in Canada where you are, Feroz, who's most likely to have those diseases, these kinds of chronic conditions? It's people who live without good health care from the time they are born, who live in areas that don't have easy access to healthy food, but instead have all too easy access only to cheap fast food with little nutrition, who have little access to clean water because the water is poisoned by manufacturing, that sort of thing, who live in the most polluted areas. It's the poorest people. And in our countries, the poorest people are disproportionately, by a vast margin, likely to be Black or brown. So that's what we're dealing with here. This
or
is
indeed indigenous.
Or indigenous people. It's here.
The Navajo Nation is being
Navajo Nation is the worst place right now in this country. I think in First Nations in Canada, I assume it's in the same position for the same reasons. The lack of healthcare, the lack of sufficient healthcare, the lack of sufficient healthy food, the lack of all of these things that make possible a protected life where somebody can be my age and not feel particularly vulnerable because I grew up white and middle class so that I had healthcare as a child. I don't have these chronic diseases that emerge in children and remain with them for life. That's what we're dealing with here, is the consequences of that legacy of racism, the legacy of inequality that shapes the way that power in the United States came to be. The fact that our nation was based on genocide and slavery in its origins. And yes, we know from the great historian Howard Zinn that not only was our country based on slavery, African labor that was brought here in chains, and genocide against the indigenous people who owned this land, but that it was also based on movements against genocide and slavery for all of those generations since. But we also know who has paid the price of that genocide and slavery in those generations since that time.
Indeed. And on the one hand, we can see our ruling classes, our elites, our governments taking advantage of this situation to enforce a greater despotism, a greater militarization, and a greater control of the population.
Absolutely.
But I found it very encouraging also that on May the 1st, and it was predominantly from the African American and so-called what they call Black and brown communities, that there was some mobilization, that people organized caravans, there were rent strikes, there were, it was incredibly encouraging. And it seems to me that that's the contestation that we face.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The ruling class has shown that they've got the money, they can print the money that's needed. And so that myth has been broken.
Right.
The potential for organizing, it seems to me, the key to what might determine the future. How much do you know about protests that are going on and organizing going on, both in America, but also beyond?
No, it is amazingly inspiring, as you say. May Day this year was such a relief in a certain way to see people not in the streets in the same way, although, as you say, there were some very creative uses of protests in the street. There were car caravans. In a few places, people, including some healthcare workers, protested very carefully, far apart, maintaining social distance with their masks, spacing themselves out in very visible areas, not far from the Capitol, in fact. So all of that was going on. And one of the things that we're seeing is, with the rhetoric that's going on in this country, and I imagine elsewhere as well, we are suddenly identifying and acknowledging who are the, quote, essential workers, who for the first time are not only the doctors that are the heroes, but it's all the healthcare workers, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies, the people who are the cooks and the janitors in hospitals, who literally are putting their lives at risk every day just to go into work, and putting at risk the lives of their families when they go home with unknown access to the germs on their body, to the viruses on their body. And they don't have adequate masks and gloves and all that they need to keep themselves safe. So we've identified them as the essential workers. We've identified them as heroes. You had, in this outrageous militarized show of support, you had here the Army and the Air Force jets that do these magic tricks, basically, that fly around, in formations and whatever, and, get little kids to say, oh, look at that. They flew in honor of those heroic workers, but they are not raising their pay. They are not providing them with the materials they need to stay safe. And it was those issues that brought many of those workers out into the streets. We're seeing it now with workers in the Amazon warehouses who are forced to work under speed up conditions. There were reports recently of people urinating into bottles because they didn't have enough time to take a bathroom break from the work line where they were forced to work at this incredible pace. And in the meantime, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, we find out that in the first quarter of this year, when over 30 million people in this country alone have lost their job and are left with nothing, he has earned something like $25 billion more. And we know that Jeff Bezos could pay the entire budget of the World Health Organization for 10 years. He could write a check and be left with $116 billion of his personal fortune left afterwards. It's criminal. It's absolutely criminal. And this is the disparity that we're facing. Colleagues of mine at the Institute for Policy Studies recently released a new report called The Billionaire Bonanza, documenting how the billionaire class in this country has profited in these last weeks and months of devastation for everyone else. So it's a very clear distinction here, where we're talking about the need to raise the issue of the insufficient wages, insufficient protection at the bottom, and challenge those at the top.
But all of these things are becoming more visible. What do you see as the consequence of that increased visibility?
Yeah, that's the exciting part. I mean, I think that huge components of elite voices in the US, of influencers, of whatever terms we want to use, but people whose voices are heard, are talking with a different voice, a different tone. The New York Times has run an extraordinary series of collections of voices of those losing their jobs. They have been documenting the impact on the poorest in a whole different way than they traditionally have. The Washington Post, the network television, the legacy networks, CNN, all of these sort of mainstream outlets are reflecting an extraordinary level of concern, not necessarily coming up with proposals of what it's going to take to change that, not usually identifying the systemic nature, but even that, in a series, for example, in the New York Times recently, about specifically the systemic basis of the inequalities in the United States. It was an extraordinary thing. They had a 2 full-page long editorial position of the New York Times editorial board that started with the situations in the past where massive crisis had led to major shifts in the United States. So one of them, very early on, I think it was in the War of 1812, they said following that you had the Homestead Act that allowed anyone to go out and claim land on which they could then build farms, they could build houses, they could build new communities. It was, they could get 160 acres for free. And I'm sitting,
as long as they were white.
Well, exactly. And I'm sitting there fuming on who already belonged to that land and to whom did that land belong? What happened to Native people? And it went through a bunch of examples like that. When women won the right to vote after the pandemic of 1918, but it was only white women who got the right to vote. And I'm fuming about all this. And look, they're leaving out. You get to the end of the article and they go through it all. They go through, but we must understand how these things were limited. The 160 acres of the Homestead Act was on land stolen from Native people. The right for women to vote only applied to white women. And I'm like, wait a minute, who took over the New York Times editorial board here? How did this happen? It happened because the inequality is now so visible that it cannot be shunted aside. Too many people are affected by it, and too many other people are seeing it. Too many people have to walk down their own streets, seeing every little mom and pop shop has not only been closed, but most of them are now gone, and the signs are up for rent because they can no longer pay the rent, and they know they will not be able to come back. So what it looks like, as you started, when this is over, we don't know. Will there be a massive concentration of commercial and industrial and manufacturing capacity in this country? Will the Walmarts be taking over even more? Or will we see an entirely new economic basis where there will be cooperation, there will be cooperatives emerging where workers take over their old shops or plants or factories and begin to run them on egalitarian terms? Is that a possibility? Are any of these things possible? I don't think we know yet. But I think what's different this time around than in earlier crises, whether it was the 2008-9 financial crisis, whether it was 9/11, in our recent history, crises that led to massive changes, we didn't see this kind of awareness while the crisis was underway of how dramatic the systemic causes are within it.
But while we're talking about visibility, let me ask you, you mentioned earlier on that because of this pandemic, people's attention are on the pandemic and its effects, not on the wars that are going on. To what extent is the Trump regime taking advantage of that lack of visibility to increase their military assaults around the world?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's less visible in the militarism war side of things that there has been a massive escalation. The escalation has been more quantitative than qualitative, unlike, for example, the massive escalation in overt racism that we are seeing. The massive escalation in economic inequality is just so in your face. Military escalation has not had that character in most situations. The one exception being the question of Israel and Palestine, where the embrace of the most right-wing tendencies within Zionism, within the Israeli state, the embrace of that by the Trump administration has been visible and visceral in its tight embrace, with horrific consequences for Palestinian rights. Other than that, the wars have continued, and the wars had already gotten worse before this pandemic. So in a sense, the escalation was already underway, and the escalation itself continues, but without the kind of in-your-face sense that everybody must be noticing. So, for example, we saw that the number of airstrikes in Afghanistan last year, in 2019, was the highest number of airstrikes in a decade. So Trump was already escalating. I don't think that I haven't seen the figures yet for the first quarter of this year, but I'm not sure that he's escalated beyond that massive escalation that was already underway. The troop withdrawals that were already talked about were always more talk than they were actual withdrawals. So I think we're seeing a continuing escalation of wars. We're seeing a continuation of the Obama era transformation of the nature of the wars against terrorism away from the Iraq, Afghanistan models of massive ground troops occupying the country to a more, a bigger focus on airstrikes and drone strikes that exist far outside the visibility to most people in this country. Most people have no idea that US drones are still bombing and attacking people in at least 7 countries that we know about, and probably significantly more. They don't know about the number of airstrikes hitting civilians in Afghanistan. So all of that is continuing, and it's a very serious problem. At the same time, we're seeing a serious escalation in the militarization of foreign policy. So diplomacy has been isolated enormously. There is just no interest in the US in diplomacy. Pompeo has emerged as the great cheerleader for war, something that was also true by when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, we should note. That isn't necessarily a difference. But what we are also seeing is that in this period, the focus on militarization of policy, things like building walls, is not only going on the southern border of the United States between the US and Mexico, and it's not only going on inside Palestinian territories created by Israel. We're seeing a US-Israeli collaboration that is now going global in urging and pushing and enabling the militarization of borders all around the world. My colleague, Carrie Peterson-Smith at IPS, who works in my project, the New Internationalism Project, has been doing some very important research on this question of militarization of borders. And one of the things that he's noticed is that there's a major chunk of money in the Pentagon budget that nobody really talks about very much, which is focused on providing other countries, other militaries, with a better ability to militarize their borders. And that's something that is going on the global level. And we're seeing that, again, in the context of the pandemic. We're seeing the closure of borders as if somehow the virus is going to respect borders. So, you know, this militarization of foreign policy and the focus, the disdain really for diplomacy are both underway. In the Corona economic stimulus acts that the US has been passing, these billion-dollar and trillion-dollar money being sorted out on the basis of the pandemic, the first one included $10.5 billion more for the Pentagon, when the Pentagon budget is already at $738 billion, more than the next 8 countries put together, including major arms and military forces like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and Germany and Italy. All the next 8 together are still less than what the US spends on the military budget. And that then was given an additional $10.5 billion for what? For what exactly? Because the military is going to protect us from the virus? Clearly not. I wrote an article with my colleague, Reverend William Barber, the head of the co-director of the Poor People's Campaign. We wrote an article in Newsweek magazine a few weeks ago about the need for public health civilians, public health officials, not the military, to take control of that taxpayer-funded access to the military hospitals. There are 50 military-only hospitals in this country. There's a whole separate set of military-only stockpiles of things like ventilators, masks, all the things that are in short supply. And the military gets to decide, what do we want to hold on to and what do we want to maybe give a little bit, maybe a few we'll give to you, as if they are somehow some separate country with the right to make their own decisions about where those materials should go when they are purchased by taxpayers. So all of these challenges about the role of the military in the context of this pandemic go far beyond only the continuation of wars that are now going on outside of public view.
But these are expressions of solidarity amongst that faction of our ruling elites.
Yes, the right wing has a very strong kind of internationalism underway right now. Absolutely.
And where is ours? What are the
Ours is there.
potentials?
Ours is there. Just this morning, I was watching another webinar. We're doing a lot of webinars these days. This one sponsored by a set of international organizations, from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation to the Transnational Institute to the Institute for Policy Studies to a host of other organizations around the world, with people from India and Brazil and the US on the panel, and a wide range of questioners that were coming in from all over the world, who were talking specifically about this question of where is the left's response around this. And it's problematic. I mean, it's not, another one of my colleagues, John Pfeffer, has recently done a new report on the rise of the right wing globally and the left's response to that globally. And one of the things he saw is that the right wing is doing much better than we are at building internationally. They are sharing more, they are collaborating more, they are learning more from each other than we are. It's a challenge to us all on the progressive side of things, on the left side of things, that we are not doing it sufficiently. But I think we are starting. I mean, one of the ironies here is that because we are now all stuck in our homes or in various circumstances, we are facing a situation in which we are spending a lot more time on situations like this, when we are talking with people from around the world. We're exchanging ideas, we're sharing news, and we're sharing strategies for how to move forward. We're sharing considerations of what kind of a post-pandemic world do we want to build. We know we're going to have to build it. It's not going to emerge on its own. But we have to be planning it now, even while we are focusing so much of our energy on the need for immediate social solidarity with those who are the most impacted by this disaster.
I think one of the weaknesses of the left over the last couple of decades has surely been that there's a lot of discussions between the elites of the left, but the voices of the most dispossessed, who are organized in various places, gets little hearing. We are not used to listening. We're very good at proclaiming. What would you say to that?
I would say it's absolutely true. I would say it's absolutely true. Now, we have some options of things that have changed. What I mentioned earlier about our reliance these days on the internet-based engagement rather than flying around the world to meetings and conferences and protests and that sort of thing. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that there is still an enormous digital divide within our countries and between our countries. Who has access to consistent internet availability? Who can participate in these conversations? Is not everyone who's engaged at the grassroots level of the progressive movement. What I think we are seeing, though, is that there are efforts underway that have been underway for a while, not only because of the pandemic, to challenge that. There are left organizations whose base is very much the most impacted communities. The work here in the United States, for instance, of the Poor People's Campaign, which has linked, tens of thousands of people around the country with state-based organizations in 40 different states that have brought people together earlier in the streets in Washington and elsewhere. These days on large online mobilizations, planning for a very big one on June 20th, what would have been a giant mobilization in Washington, but very much now focused on online. These are the kinds of organizations that are now reaching the poorest people in our countries, people in native reservations, people in places like Appalachia, people in Black communities around the country that have the highest levels of unemployment, the lowest levels of access to healthcare, and the highest levels of voter suppression. So they are the ones most often denied their right to participate in democratic processes. All of those communities can be mapped, and they are all the same communities. The poorest communities, the darkest communities, the Black and brown communities, the ones with the least ability to vote, et cetera. You can map that, and people are doing that. So I think there is that kind of an effort underway. One of the challenges that we face is how to build internationalism and anti-militarism into that kind of organizing. And that's not something that comes automatically. Again, I would point to one example with the Poor People's Campaign. They partnered with us at the Institute for Policy Studies 2 years ago to draft an audit 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King's last campaign, that what he was working on when he was assassinated in 1968, was the first Poor People's Campaign that brought ultimately thousands of people to Washington to demand equality, to demand an economic system that was based on equality and not based on racism and inequality in the way that it always had been. And Dr. King reminded us of the evil triplets of racism, poverty, and militarism. And the new Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, came together to say, we're going to remake that, add climate to the mix, and look at an audit of where is the United States now, 50 years later, on the question of racism, on the question of systemic poverty, on the question of ecological devastation, and on the question of militarism and the war economy. And we produced a major report called The Souls of Poor Folk that analyzes precisely that from this very intersectional basis. How does the question of racism play out when we're looking at climate? How does misogyny and sexism play out when we're looking at militarism? How do we look at poverty from both a race-based question and the impact of the military budget that takes 53 cents out of every federal dollar? So we looked at all of that in this report called The Souls of Poor Folk to say, how do we make the links between those movements where the poorest people are always the ones at the bottom of that hierarchy of rights and privileges?
Phyllis, this has been as rich, if not a richer, conversation as we all expected of you, and it's really absolutely terrific to speak with you. I wish we had more time to talk, but also more time to meet. So at some point we have to.
Yes.
This is no substitute for real human interaction.
No,
but
but
I
it
want
is
to
for now, and for later we will be together again.
Indeed, and I want to thank you so much for sparing time. I know you are incredibly busy, and so for taking time to join us, I really appreciate that. Any final words you'd like to make?
I would just say that as we're all focused on caring for those closest to us, we have to keep in mind those around the world. This is a global challenge to us all, to maintain our internationalism, even as we focus on immediate solidarity with our neighbors, with those who are the most desperate in our own communities. We have to do it all. We have a lot of work to do.
We have a lot to do. Well, what better things to fight for than internationalism and building a new world? Phyllis Bennis, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope we will have further conversations down the line.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks very much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That was Phyllis Bennis from the IPS, Institute of Policy Studies, and who works in that program, who heads the New Internationalism Project there. And I strongly advise you to check out that website and to familiarize yourself with some excellent reports which have appeared at IPS and in the New Internationalism Project. So thank you for joining us today. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press, wishing you all well and hope you look after yourselves. And thank you for joining us here on Organizing in the Time of COVID.